One of the most important concepts in programming is functions. Now you can think of a function as some kind of machine that on one side takes in some raw material as input, then it somehow processes and transforms those inputs, and on the other side it outputs a ready-to-use product. Now in JavaScript there are a couple of built-in functions. So for example we have the parse int function, which takes a string and then it will, from the string, find a number, basically. So let's say 24 point whatever. And if we want to see the result of this, we could now store it into a variable like before, but we can also simply log it to the console. And there's no need for you to write this code. This is just so I can show you, basically, that we can use a built-in function like this. So we write the function name and then we open parentheses, and then here is where we pass in the, what I called before, raw materials as an input. Now in JavaScript, what we write here is called an argument for the function, right? And in fact, we did use other functions before, and even console.log is itself a function. So we call the function here, then the parentheses, and then we pass in this value, in this case is correct, as an argument into the function. So the input here is correct, and what this function will then do, in this case, is to log something to the console. And there are many other examples of functions that we used before. So whenever we see these parentheses, we know that it is a function. So query selector is a function, add event listener is a function, and all these are basically built-in functions. But of course, even more helpful than using built-in functions is to create our own functions. So let's do that, and we do it by writing the function keyword, and then we give the function a name. So what we're going to do now is to simply calculate the age of a fact. So for example, if a fact was created in 2015 and now it's 2022, then the fact is 7 years old. And so we will create a function that will calculate that automatically. So let's call this function calc fact age, and now we specify parentheses and we give a name to the argument that we later pass in. Now this is technically called a parameter, but let's keep it simple and also call it an argument. So what we need as an input for this function here is the year in which the fact was created. So year, and then here the function block where we can actually write the code for the function. However, before doing that, I want to actually call this function here just to show you how we can call the function, and so that it makes more sense for you what this value here will be. So what the year argument will be. So we're going to call this function by writing, just like with all the other functions, calc fact age, and then we specify the year. So using the example of 2015 that I used before, and so that 2015 will then be this year. So inside our function, we can then use this year variable basically to calculate the age of the fact. So how can we do that? Well, let's create a variable. Let's say current year, just to store the year in there and to make everything a bit more perceptible. So let's say it's 2022. At the time of recording, at least it is. And then we can calculate the age. And that is by doing the current year minus the year in which the fact was created. So that would be, in the case of 2015, 2022 minus 2015, right? So that would be the age of this fact. And so in this case, in this function, it is current year minus the year that is passed in. Okay, and now we are ready to actually output something from this function. And what we want to output is, of course, that age value. So we do that by using the return keyword. So we write return age. So that's the value that we want to return here, right? And now to experiment with this, we need to call this function, which we're already doing. But then to see the result, we need to also store it any variable and then log it to the console. Let's just say h1, just like this, and then console.log h1. Let's give it a save, see if everything is correct, and it is. So 7 is indeed the result of doing 2022 minus 2015. So let's recap what just happened here. So we created our own function, which is called calc_fact_age, and then we pass in a value into it. So this is the argument which we can think of as an input to a machine. So in this case, an input to a machine which calculates the age of a fact. So this value of 2015, which is the input of the function, is inside the function called year. So we can think of this year here as just another variable. So inside of this function here, year will now be 2015. And so then we can simply do the simple calculation of the current year minus that year that was inputted. Now, what I have here is simply a comment. So just like in CSS, where we also wrote comments, we can do the same in JavaScript. We simply do it with these two slashes. So that's how we write comments in CSS. Now we could, of course, have done it a lot simpler without these intermediate variables here. So we could also have, let me just comment it out. We could also simply have done return 2022 minus the year. So that would give us the same result, but I still wanted to do it step by step here. So let's uncomment this, and we can just hit Command or Control / actually to toggle comments. And yeah, so it's better like this, because now I want to show you something else, which is that instead of manually writing the date or the current year, we can actually get JavaScript to calculate it for us. So we can do new date dot get full year. Well, not that one. Get full year like this. All right. And so you see the result is still 7. But if you are now watching this in the future in some other year, then you will get another result. Now, by the way, we can also see the result of these calculations directly in the console. So at least of like built-in functions like this. So we can clear the console here just to have some more space. And if I paste it here now and hit enter, then you get immediately the result right here in the console. And the same is true for some other calculations. So you can do whatever you want here. And this is valid JavaScript. And so you can run any JavaScript right here in the console. Okay, and by the way, you see that this here is a function call, and then immediately we get another function call, but more about what this is, like with the dot and all this stuff, a bit later in this section. For now, just to make this function a bit more useful, or to actually show its usefulness, let's reuse it a couple of times, because that's actually the main goal of creating functions. So let's console.log, and remember how I told you that we don't always need to create variables, because all that we need here is a value. And this function will now create a value. So it will produce a value, which is this age. And therefore, we can simply call the function directly in here. So calc fact_age, and let's say 2020, give it a save, and then here you get 2. Of course, because 2022 minus 2020 is simply 2. Okay, let's just do another one. Just to show that we can really reuse a function as many times as we want. And that is the main goal, actually, of writing a function. It's to create a reusable piece of code, in this case, all this code here, so that we don't have to write it over and over again. And with that, we actually have the fundamentals of functions down. Now, not all functions need to accept some input data, so we could just leave it empty and do some other calculation in the function. And also, not all functions need to return something. So we could just create a function that, for example, logs to the console 5 times, and so that function would simply do some work, but not return anything. So all of those are valid use cases, But most of the time, we actually want to give a function some value so that it can work with it and return something else, which is exactly what we did here. We gave it a year, so we gave the function a year argument, and it then returned for us this age. Great, so now you know how to write your own functions. And now in the next lecture, let's revisit the if-else statement that we used here. So that's another important aspect of JavaScript, and so let's move on.